The lake was supposed to be a place of joy, a simple escape for families looking to cool off on a hot afternoon. But for 10-year-old Maya, it became a fight for her life. She splashed and laughed with her friends just moments ago, but now she was struggling, gasping for air, arms flailing as the water pulled her under. Nearby, a group of police officers stood by watching. Their radios were silent, their hands resting on their belts. People screamed for help, pointing to the water, begging them to do something, but they didn't move. Maya's mother, Sophia, pushed past the crowd, her heart pounding. "Help her, please," she cried, but the officers barely glanced her way. Every second felt like an eternity. Her baby was drowning, and the very people sworn to protect were doing nothing. Then, the sound of tires screeching. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot. The door flew open, and out stepped a man whose presence shifted the entire scene. Governor Elijah Carter, a father first, a leader second. His eyes locked onto the water, and in that instant he understood everything. What happened next would shake the entire city. It would expose deep truths, force tough conversations, and leave people asking one question: if he hadn't arrived, would they have ever moved? This is a story about justice, power, and the undeniable truth of who gets to be saved and who is left to drown. Governor Elijah Carter didn't hesitate. He ran straight toward the water, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud as he dove in. The cold shock didn't matter, only Maya did. His heart pounded as he pushed through the waves, scanning the surface until he saw a tiny, lifeless hand just below. He reached, grabbed, and pulled her up. On the shore, Sophia sobbed, her hands shaking as she watched. The officers, still frozen in place, exchanged glances. One finally spoke into his radio, but it was too late. Elijah had already done their job. Maya's small body was limp in his arms as he carried her back, the weight of her stillness heavier than anything he had ever faced in his career. He laid her on the grass, his hands shaking as he checked for breath. Silence. No movement. "Come on, baby. Breathe," he whispered, his voice cracking. The crowd stood in shocked silence. A few people had their phones out now, recording everything. The governor, soaking wet, fighting for his daughter's life. The officers, still unmoved. Every second dragged on, stretching the tension so tight it could snap. Then, the sirens. Late. Too late. An ambulance finally pulled in, paramedics rushing out. But the question lingered in the air like smoke. Why did it take this long? Why did it take *him*? And as Elijah looked up, locking eyes with the officers who had refused to act, he knew this was far from over. Maya coughed. A weak, strained sound, but enough to send a wave of relief through Elijah's body. The paramedics moved in fast, checking her pulse, wrapping her in blankets. Sophia dropped to her knees beside her daughter, stroking her soaked hair, whispering prayers of gratitude. But even as life returned to Maya's small body, Elijah's hands curled into fists. The officers were still standing there, watching, silent, no urgency, no remorse, as if they hadn't just ignored a drowning child, as if they hadn't just stood by while his little girl nearly died. Elijah rose to his feet, his wet clothes clinging to him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something dangerous, something past anger. He took a slow step toward the officers. "Why?" His voice was low, controlled, but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. No one answered. The nearest officer, a man with a rigid stance and a badge polished to a shine, cleared his throat. "We were assessing the situation." A bitter laugh escaped Elijah. Assessing. A child was drowning, and they had been assessing. He took another step, towering over the officer now. "Would you have assessed if she looked different?" The officer's jaw tightened. He didn't reply, but he didn't need to. The silence said it all. The weight of it pressed against everyone watching. Phones were still recording. This wasn't just a father's pain anymore. It was something bigger, and the world was about to see it. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken yet impossible to ignore. The crowd edged closer, their whispers growing louder, their camera lenses locked onto the moment. Every angle was being captured, Elijah's soaked clothes clinging to him, the tension in his jaw, the officers standing stiff, their silence stretching into something uglier. Sophia held Maya close, her arms wrapped around their daughter as if she could shield her from all of this. But there was no shielding her from the truth. Not now. Not ever. Maya's small body trembled, whether from the cold or the weight of what had just happened. No one could tell. Elijah's breathing was slow, measured, but his fingers twitched at his sides. He was a man who had spent years choosing his words carefully, knowing that every sentence carried weight, every reaction could be twisted. But this wasn't politics. This was his daughter, and no amount of training could dull the rawness of that. One of the officers shifted, his boots crunching against the gravel. "We had no way of knowing the severity of the situation," he said, his voice too even, too rehearsed. Elijah's head tilted slightly. "You saw her drowning." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, sharp enough to cut through the officer's weak defense. Another officer, one who had been silent until now, muttered something under his breath. Elijah's eyes snapped to him. "Say it louder," he demanded. The man hesitated. Then, after a beat, he scoffed. "You think being governor makes you special." The words hit like a slap, but Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he let the silence that followed stretch painfully long, let the crowd take in what had just been said. Because now it was all out in the open. It wasn't about a misunderstanding. It wasn't about protocol. It was about who they saw as worth saving. The sirens faded into the distance as the ambulance carrying Maya pulled away, but the real battle was just beginning. Elijah's stare didn't waver. The officer's words hung in the air, thick with challenge, with something unspoken but deeply understood. The crowd felt it too. The weight of history, of moments like this playing out over and over. But this time, there were cameras, there were witnesses, and there was a man with power who refused to look away. Then, a voice from the crowd, a woman. They knew exactly what they were doing. More murmurs followed, people nodding, exchanging glances. And then, a new voice, deeper, firmer. "Check the body cams." The words cut through the tension like a knife. It was a younger officer, standing at the edge of the group. His face was tight, his posture tense, as if he had been holding something in for too long. The older officers shot him a look, sharp, warning. But it was too late. Elijah's focus snapped to him. Body cams. The young officer swallowed hard. They were on the whole time. The energy in the crowd shifted instantly. The officers stiffened, suddenly aware that all eyes were on them. Elijah took a slow breath, his mind racing. If the cameras had been rolling, then there was footage that could prove everything, footage that could tell the truth. The officer who had spoken earlier, the one who scoffed, let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You really think that footage will see the light of day?" And that was it, the second crack in their defense, the unspoken truth slipping out for everyone to hear. Elijah stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the officer lean in. "Then I guess I need to make sure it does." The crowd erupted, the shift from fear to anger almost instant. The truth was out now, but just how deep did it go? And how far would they go to keep it buried? Elijah didn't wait. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there, in front of everyone. The officers shifted uneasily, eyes darting between each other. They weren't used to being challenged like this, not publicly, not by someone with real power. "Lock the footage down," Elijah said into the phone, his voice calm but firm. "I want it secured immediately." The crowd hushed. The young officer, the one who had spoken up, looked nervous now. His superiors glared at him like he had just thrown a match onto gasoline. But it was too late. The damage was done. One of the senior officers, the one with the polished badge, stepped forward. His face was unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Governor Carter, with all due respect, This isn't your jurisdiction. Elijah gave a dry, humorless laugh. A child was drowning in front of you. That asterisk is asterisk my jurisdiction. The officer's jaw tightened. I suggest you let this go. The threat was subtle but clear. The weight of the moment pressed down on Elijah. He had spent years playing the game, knowing when to push and when to back off. But this wasn't politics. This was his daughter. And then a new sound, a phone chiming. But not his. One of the officers glanced at his wrist, his smartwatch lighting up with a notification. A live feed. Someone had already leaked the footage. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people pulled out their phones. The video was spreading, faster than they could contain it. In real time, the world was watching. Watching the officers stand there. Watching them refuse to move. Watching Maya fight for her life alone. The officer's face went pale. "Turn that off," he snapped at one of the bystanders. But it was over. Elijah turned back to face him, his expression unreadable. "Looks like I don't have to let it go." And in that moment he knew the story wouldn't be buried. The truth was out. But what happened next? That was up to the world. The crowd stood still, their eyes locked on their screens as the video played over and over. There was no spinning the truth now, no covering it up. The officers, once so sure of their silence, now looked unsure, exposed under the weight of their own inaction. Elijah turned to Sophia, who was still holding Maya close, rocking her gently. Their daughter's breathing had steadied, her small fingers gripping her mother's shirt as if afraid to let go. Elijah crouched beside them, placing a hand on Maya's damp hair. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're safe." But safe was a complicated word. Minutes later, police officials arrived, different ones this time. The ones who knew there was no sweeping this away. Questions were asked, statements taken. The officers who had stood by, the ones who had said nothing, were escorted away, their expressions unreadable. Elijah stood tall watching. He had spent his life fighting battles with words, with policies. But this was something different. This was personal. As the family finally stepped away, heading toward their car, a reporter called out, "Governor Carter, what happens now?" Elijah paused. The answer wasn't simple. Justice wasn't instant. Change wasn't easy. But the world had seen the truth, and once people saw the truth, they had to decide what to do with it. He met the reporter's eyes. "Now." He glanced at Maya, then back at the cameras. "Now we make sure it never happens again."